So animation is hard, right? It's even harder to explain in a brief amount of time. That's why I'm just gonna briefly cover how to animate a bouncing ball. It's something that every animator has to do, and it's a very good way to get into animation. It's a nice little exercise to learn the basics, I guess. So for the sake of time, I'm gonna keep this as simple as possible. If you want a more in-depth look at how to animate a bouncing ball, like the timing, the spacing, and all that stuff, there's a search bar right at the top of YouTube right there. You can look up how to animate a bouncing ball. There's probably like a million videos, so go nuts. And for those of you who are still here, hi! Now let's get started. Okay, so first you're going to have the line of motion, you know, where the ball is going to go before you even draw the ball. So you're going to have a little arc that goes along, touches the ground, then goes off the screen. After it bounces, you're going to want the arc to be a little shorter than it was previously, because that's how gravity works. It sucks like that. You can't just bounce on forever. Momentum, you know. Next, you're going to want to add in the keyframes of the ball bouncing.
But what's a keyframe?
A keyframe is a frame that is drawn to indicate a change in pose or a important part of a motion. Like when somebody is walking, first keyframe would be where their foot touches the ground. Second one would be when the foot is in midair, halfway through a step. Then the final one is when the foot touches the ground again. I know that's not really an in-depth explanation of keyframes, but I'm trying to keep this short and simple. Okay, so for the ball bouncing, you're going to want a keyframe at the peak of each arc for the bounce, as well as where the ball touches the ground. For the two keyframes that are at the peak of each arch, the ball is going to be pretty much perfectly circular because there's not a lot of force going on with the ball at the moment, and it's pretty much just floating there for a brief moment before it comes crashing back down to the earth. As for the keyframe in the middle, where the ball is touching the ground, we're going to have it squished and heavily exaggerated as though the ball was a ball of pudding or something like that, except a lot more bouncy and a lot less messy. But how do I get the ball from keyframe to keyframe? It's not magic. You're right, it's not. But there is a substitute called in-betweens. In-betweens are generally drawn after keyframes, and they tend to take place directly in the middle of two keyframes to better understand where the animation is going and what the drawing looks like in between those keyframes. Hence the name in between. It's a secret, don't tell anybody. Between the first keyframe and the second keyframe, the in between there is going to be just the ball slightly exaggerated in its stretchiness. Not too much, because the gravity is not that strong unless you're on like some crazy alien space planet, but I don't really think you're going that detailed with your bouncing ball animation. I don't know, that's where you do what you do. As for the in-between that's in between the second and the third keyframe of the bouncing ball, that one's going to be a little bit more exaggerated because of the way it's squished on the ground, because it has to unleash that energy somewhere, and it's going to unleash it by bouncing. So it's going to be all stretched and stuff because it's launching itself off of the ground, you know? So now you have your line of movement, your keyframes, and your two in-betweens between those three keyframes. That is going to make it a lot easier to fully animate this ball. It's something that happens for every animation. It's not just the ball exclusive. This is a very important process.
Wait, so you mean to tell me that we haven't animated anything at all yet?
Well, technically you have, but it's just not in its completed state yet. I mean...
You lied to me! You're a deceiver!
Shh. It's called patience. You're gonna need a lot of that. Alright, framework's down. So now we can draw the final frames, which would be the frames that are in between, the in-betweens, and the keyframes. Okay? For the first two frames that are in between the first keyframe and the first in-between, they're gonna be relatively close to each other because the ball is still gaining momentum. And it's gonna be slightly, ever so slightly stretching to match that shape of the first in-between. For the next sequence of frames in between, you got the frames in between the first in between and the second keyframe. These are also going to be two frames there, but they're going to be a little bit farther apart. And the second frame there is going to be touching the ground, but is not actually squishing from the impact because it's just at that moment touching the ground. It's not actually reacting yet. For the next sequence, you're going to have those two frames that are in between the second keyframe and the second in between very different from each other. The first one is going to be in the same position as the second keyframe, but it's going to be more squished, as though it's still receiving the impact from landing. Now for the second frame there, it's going to look more like the second in-between, but more exaggerated, more stretched, but it's still going to be touching the ground. That's to give off this sense like, ew, it's just launching, it's just flying off, and that it's going to go flying in some direction. And finally, from the second in-between to the third keyframe, it's basically going to be the opposite of the first sequence that's drawn, so that it looks like it's starting to sort of become more circular as it's losing its momentum and it's becoming less stretchy as it gets to that point. So there you go, that's all the frames you need to animate a bouncing ball in a very simple manner. All you have to do now is just draw over all those frames that you did, make it look good, get rid of all the stuff you don't need, and you're good to go. Show it off to your friends. Looks cool, right? Yeah, it's great. Okay, I didn't go over things like frame rate, animating in twos, timing, spacing, anticipation, follow through, and all of that stuff. All of that stuff is so important to animation, but I didn't have time for it here. If you want to know more about this stuff, there's a lot of videos that can tell you more about these things and even go more in depth about how to properly animate a bouncing ball. For now, go there, search on the YouTube thing, you can find a lot of really good stuff. As for me, I guess I'll see you later, I guess. Bye.